Life Audio.
Hello. Thank you for listening to Your Daily Bible Verse, the podcast that examines one verse each day to learn more about God and His will for our lives. I'm your host, Kyle Norman. After a brief message from one of our sponsors, we will continue with our series, Moses, From Fearful to Faithful, with a discussion of the next verse, Exodus chapter 14, verse 22. Today's verse can be found in Exodus chapter 14, verse 22. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and their left. Faith grows when we move past our expectations and our comforts. Now that sounds nice until we have to walk through it. And that's what Israel had to do. Right from the start, the way of liberation, it didn't look like they thought it would. Israel expected to leave the slavery of Egypt and walk seamlessly towards the land of promise with ease and blessings. But that's not what happened. Scripture records that they were barely beyond Egyptian borders when the easy road to the promised land became complicated. We heard last week how God led them in a twisty way, this way and that way. And now, not only was the larger, stronger, and now angrier Egyptian army following in close behind them, but they were also heading straight toward the Red Sea. The way of liberation was blocked by a large body of water, and there was no indication as to how they were going to cross it. So there they were, water before them and iron behind them. Can you really blame Israel for turning to Moses and asking if God was just bringing them into the desert to destroy them? And Moses, the leader of this ragtag group, well, he also questions what God is doing. After all, he accepted this call for him to lead the people. He took the leap of faith and he followed where the pillar of God directed him. But now it seemed that that pillar was directing him to a dead end. You know, we can sometimes be critical of Israel's response to this difficulty. How quickly they seem to abandon their faith. And so it's tempting to say, well, they should have trusted in the Lord. They should have had more faith. But before we embrace such bravado, can we be honest about the fact that this can sometimes be our response too? We can also cast a critical gaze toward God whenever our life of faith, it doesn't work out as we expect it. When the promise of God seems distant or hidden, we may question God's power or God's goodness. And when we face obstacles or when we find ourselves facing destructive forces in our lives, well, it's easy to feel discouraged. Maybe you found yourself walking through such an experience. Have you encountered obstacles in your walk of faith? You know, this is why Moses' story is so important for us. Not because it presents what faith should look like if everything goes right. No, it's because Moses walks a reality of faith that we know all too well. His story is also our story. Because the fact is, the life of faith doesn't always run on a course of ease or predictability. And nor does God limit God's will to whatever fits into our plans or our understandings. God often leads us to places where we would rather not go, and places us in situations which are far beyond our control. But there's divine reasoning for this, because it's in this place where it becomes clear that God acts for us, and that we are not abandoned to the difficulties that we face. It's in those moments when we face that which feels impassable or insurmountable that we often see God do the miraculous. And so Moses says to the people standing on this water's edge, don't be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you. This is an amazing promise. When Israel felt at their wits' end, at the end of the rope, or literally at the end of the road, they were called to trust that God would indeed fight for them, provide for them, and liberate them. God's promises weren't revoked simply because the way forward seemed difficult or unclear. Israel could still rest in God's promises. And so Moses says to them that all they need to do is be still. Moses says, be still and you will see the power of God. Being still before the Lord isn't about quiet contemplation. It's about acknowledging our need for God to do what we could never do ourselves. It's about allowing God to be God for us. And this is what happens. The angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel now moves behind them and stands in between the people and the army of Egypt. And Moses stands on the edge of the sea and he raises his staff and the waters part and the people walk on solid ground. But if you read this account in Scripture, one of the things that you will notice is that it is only when Israel was ready to step into the river that they didn't know that they could cross, that God blew the waters to the side. Because our walk with God, it's a walk of faith. Is the Lord asking you to step into the unknown? Is God directing you through a course which seems fraught with difficulty or discouragement? If so, remember that the Lord has promised to fight for you, to lead you, and to provide a way for you, even if you can't see it in this moment. And if you would but take a step in the direction that the Lord is leading, well, you just might find yourself walking along a path of miracles.